morning. When I became pregnant at the brink of 40, I had already been an adult for 20 years. For most of that time, I worked as a field biologist, which meant I traveled all over the world, from the Nile River Valley in Africa to the rainforests of Central America, observing how organisms interact with the environments they inhabit. Maybe that explains why, upon learning that I was pregnant, my first thought was, wow, I'm a habitat. There is a marine mammal swimming around inside of me. Within my body is an inland ocean with a population of 1. Well, that little sea creature eventually turned into an air-breathing baby girl. And 9 years later, I am the mother of a very thoughtful 4th grader. And what do you suppose she wants to be when she grows up? A marine biologist. I'm also the mother of a 6-year-old son whose career goals include President of the United States and farmer. He would also like to be a member of the Beatles. He figures there's 2 job openings already. My husband Jeff teaches art at the school where our kids attend, and I still work full-time. So the ecology of our family life is very complex and very busy. And like a lot of families, we operate on a budget. For the past 10 years, Jeff and I have chosen to buy all organic food for our family, and when possible, locally grown organic food. Let me share with you the reasons for our family's commitment to organic. There are 5 of them. You know that saying, you are what you eat? Well, that's a true statement for all of us already born humans who dine at the table with a knife and a fork. But before birth, you are what your mother eats. I think it's worth pondering this for a minute. When a pregnant woman eats for 2, she isn't just feeding herself and feeding her baby. She's feeding herself and constructing a baby. During pregnancy, a baby is literally made from what the mother eats. From a fertilized egg, smaller than the period at the end of a sentence, comes a fully developed baby that's roughly the size and weight of a gallon of milk. Or in my son's case, a gallon of milk plus a quart of yogurt. He was a 10-pounder. In other words, except for the 46 chromosomes bequeathed to a child by its parents, a baby is made up of the rearranged molecules of air, food, and water that streamed through the mother's body while she was pregnant. That's why we biologists say that a mother's body is the first environment. So how does that work? How do air, food, and water get knitted together to form a baby? Of all the biological processes I've ever studied, embryology is hands down the most fantastical. Sometimes it seems like a magic show. For example, the lens of the eye is formed when 2 pieces of tissue bulge out and touch each other, and then the little football shape of the lens of the eye is created when those 2 tissues touch. Sometimes embryonic development is like origami, as when flat pieces of tissue fold up and roll up to form elegant 3-dimensional structures. You got your spinal cord when a flat Kleenex-like piece of tissue rolled up to form a long tube. By contrast, the development of the brain reminds me of spiders at a quilting bee. You know how a spider can rappel down the length of its own silken thread from the ceiling? That's how brain cells move inside a fetal skull. And when 2 of these spider cells touch each other, they spin webs of electrical connections between themselves. Those are called dendrites. And that's how your mind got wired together. Now, given how important all this is, to fold up and roll up and weave together not only correctly, but in precisely the right order, it's no surprise that we've evolved defenses to protect this process. The first line of defense is the placenta. The placenta is made up of blood vessels from the baby and blood vessels from the mother, and it's about the size and shape of a single-layer cake. The placenta does a remarkable job fending off what has been, over most of our evolutionary history, the principal threat to pregnancy: viruses and bacteria. The placenta's job is to keep pathogens out of the uterus and keep it completely sterile, even if the mother has a cold. Unfortunately, when it comes to synthetic chemicals, the placenta is more of an open doorway than it is a barrier. The mammalian placenta is not evolved to recognize synthetic molecules. They can easily trespass from the mother's bloodstream into the baby's umbilical cord. In some cases, the placenta actually actively pumps chemicals from the mother's body into the baby's blood, and so acts as a magnifying glass for toxic chemicals. Well, pregnancy is a nonstop chemical conversation between mother and child. Remember those migrating spider cells in the fetal brain? They move under the direction of a mother's thyroid gland. And when I was pregnant, I used to look at myself in the mirror and imagine my thyroid gland and the thyroid hormone it was making, which normally, when I was not pregnant, was simply controlling my metabolic rate. And I was imagining how now this thyroid gland hormone was crossing the placenta, going into the umbilical cord, into the brain of my baby, and serving as blazes along the trails, helping those migrating spider cells in her brain get wired together correctly. Never had a more noble task my thyroid gland had. When chemical conversations like these are disrupted or confused at critical moments by the wrong kinds of chemicals, then bad things can happen. And that's essentially the story of lead. The heavy metal called lead can paralyze migrating brain cells during the second trimester of pregnancy, and they can do so at vanishingly small amounts. Those spider cells can't spin their webs of electrical connection, brain architecture is subtly altered, and the baby is born at higher risk for things like learning disabilities, hyperactivity, and problems paying attention down the road. Conventionally produced food in the United States is typically grown with the use of synthetic pesticides. And pesticides by design are poisons. Some of them were originally developed as weapons of warfare and were only secondarily marketed to kill pests in farm fields. Before these chemicals came on the market, very little testing was done to ensure that they did not interfere with embryonic development. The story about the dangers of prenatal exposures to pesticides and other farm chemicals is an emerging one. Here's what we know so far. We know that pregnant women are routinely exposed to pesticides. We know this because we can measure pesticides in the urine of pregnant women. We also know their babies are being exposed. We know this because we can find traces of pesticides in umbilical cord blood and in amniotic fluid, that liquid bubble wrap that surrounds the baby and forms its swimming pool during pregnancy. Third, we know that laboratory animals, when exposed to very low levels of pesticide during key moments of embryonic development, can alter the development of their brain and other organs such as the breast in ways that can raise risk for problems in adult life. This might include an increased risk for cancer or changes in the animal's ability to learn. Pesticide exposure in lab animals can also contribute to miscarriage and preterm labor. Now, we don't conduct controlled human experiments on pregnant women for good reasons. So we don't yet know everything there is to know about the long-term effects of low-level pesticide exposure during pregnancy. But we do have some human studies, and the results are troubling to me. For example, a few recent studies have found links between prenatal exposure to pesticides and developmental disorders and delays in mental development during childhood. We also don't always know when we find pesticides in, say, human amniotic fluid, which we do, what the route of exposure was. Did the pregnant woman inhale these chemicals? Did she drink them with her morning tea? Was she exposed while applying lawn chemicals to her backyard? Or did she eat them with her dinner? We do know that harmful pesticides are found in everyday food. We have good data on that. We also know that organic foods contain far less pesticide residue than conventionally grown foods. We also have good data on that. What I concluded from these studies is that eating organic while I was pregnant was one way that I could lower my exposure to harmful chemicals. And as a biologist, I study the ways in which air pollution and water contamination can also sabotage the events of prenatal life. And I advocate for changes in our environmental laws that would be more protective of human health at its earliest stages. But when I was pregnant, there was little I could do as an individual woman to change my air supply or my public water system. On the other hand, I did have control over my diet. Sort of. During many months of my pregnancies, I could not eat a bean or a slab of tofu to save my life. Morning sickness for me was a 24/7 experience. and there were exactly 5 forms of protein that I could tolerate: pork chops, milk, yogurt, cheese, and scrambled eggs. But the eggs had to be very, very hot. I could also eat bananas, but they had to be very, very cold. And the milk had to be whole milk, not skim, not 2%. And Jeff was my short order cook. He made a lot of what we called emergency pizza. Now, until I became pregnant, I hadn't eaten a pork chop in 20 years. Pregnancy, for me, was a lesson in why we need an organic revolution. Pregnant women have very particular food preferences. They need to know that the foods that they crave, or at least the ones that they can tolerate, are free from chemical residues, wherever they are, up or down on the human food chain. The counter-argument is that pregnant women can avoid lots of chemical residues if they just eat low on the food chain. To avoid pesticide exposure, choose lots of plant-based foods and avoid animal fats. And that's all good advice. Some pesticides are fat-soluble and they concentrate as you move up the food chain. But that was advice that was deeply irrelevant to me when I was pregnant. During those months, I had to dine on the higher rungs of the human food chain, and I needed organic options. I needed milk, yogurt, eggs, and meat that came from animals that were fed organic feed, that were not injected with hormones, that were not routinely administered antibiotics and other veterinary drugs. So for me, organic agriculture is good prenatal care. Choosing organic food is one way a woman can reduce the risk of the trespass of toxic chemicals into her body. And like sobriety, seat belts, and not smoking, it just makes good sense. Because if the human food chain is contaminated, so too is the ecosystem of a mother's body. If a mother's body is contaminated, so too is the child who inhabits it. Toxic chemicals are not something any of us want to pass along to our children. Well, now that I'm done with making babies, and therefore with pork chops, organic food serves another role in my life. So here's my second reason for staying with organic, and this one might surprise you. Buying organic saves time. Really. My son was born when my daughter was not yet 3 years old. I had a new book coming out, so I didn't really have the luxury of a maternity leave. During those early days, when our children were very young, my husband took over the home front, and he also did most of the grocery shopping. I was, of course, the chief breastfeeder, so that didn't exactly leave me without any familiar responsibilities at all. And what Jeff quickly learned, and then passed this knowledge along to me, is that success in getting through the checkout lane depends on speed. With an infant and a 2-year-old in the shopping cart, at least one of whom is hungry and the other of whom needs a nap and a diaper change, leisurely shopping is not an option. Stopping to read labels was to invite disaster in the form of squabbling and meltdowns and so on. When Jeff saw the organic seal, he knew that certain standards of production had been met. The food was grown without pesticides or growth hormones. It didn't contain synthetic dyes or artificial preservatives. He could just grab it and go. Ergo, organic food saves time. Now, I'm a pretty good chemist. I dare say I can interpret a food label more expertly than my artist spouse. However, I don't know all the toxicological profiles for every chemical name I read on a food label. I don't know all the additives and colorants and preservatives, nor am I familiar with every pesticide used on every ingredient and what the possible health effects are. And even if I were a walking, talking, toxicological encyclopedia that could keep up with every new study on every chemical in food when I do the shopping, I have the same 2 kids in the shopping cart my husband does. I don't have time to read labels. In short, buying organic means you don't have to be a chemist to buy food. And even if you are, you don't have to deploy your skills with every purchase. Here's another way organic food saves me time. It's a way of doing something about our ongoing environmental crisis that doesn't require any extra effort on my part. I have a lot of concerns about the world we are leaving our children. I want my kids to inherit a planet with clean rivers, coral reefs, fish stocks, functioning jet stream, air that doesn't cause asthma, snow in January, and a couple of ice caps on either pole. Professionally, as a biologist, I spend my days documenting various threats to our ecological life support system. But honestly, as a citizen, I don't have time to take action on all the various ecological concerns I have. On the other hand, by directing my food dollars to organic farmers, I am doing something about a whole lot of environmental problems all at once. It's like killing a lot of birds with one stone. Or more to the point, it's like saving a lot of birds. Here in the United States, we use about 1 billion pounds of pesticides every year. Those chemicals don't stay on the fields where they're sprayed. They evaporate and rise into the jet stream. They drift for miles in the wind. They fall in rain. They attach themselves to house dust, to snowflakes, to dewdrops, to fog. They sink like a falling curtain into groundwater and lake sediments. Pesticides soak into earthworms and tree bark and whale blubber. They turn up in the eggs of songbirds in Illinois, inside glaciers in Canada, and within the soft bodies of clams in Maine. Some pesticides used in the strawberry and tomato fields contribute to the destruction of the ozone layer. Some pesticides used to grow corn can turn male frogs into hermaphrodites. Some pesticides cause cancer in shellfish. Some poison bees and other pollinators. Some cause fish to become directionally confused and unable to swim in a straight line. Some halt photosynthesis and so kill native prairie plants. By directing my food dollars toward organic farmers, I feel like I'm doing something about all those problems just by shopping for dinner, which I have to do anyway. By buying organic, I'm helping to protect drinking water, pollinators, frogs, birds, and the ozone layer. And when I buy organic and local, I'm also doing something about climate change, and not only by shortening the distance between farm and table. New research suggests that soils on organic farms can actually help sequester carbon. My third reason for buying organic is an obvious one. The best science done to date shows that most organic produce is free from pesticide residues and most conventional produce is not. I conclude from this that organic food is better for kids. A recent study measured levels of certain insecticides in the urine of preschool children living in Seattle. Children with conventional diets had on average 9 times more organophosphates in their urine than children fed organic produce. Now here's the good news. Switching kids from conventional food to organic food caused the levels of these pesticides to disappear from urine and saliva within a day or two. And when these children were switched back to conventional diets, the pesticides started showing up in their bodies again. This set of studies demonstrates that diet really is a significant source of pesticide exposure for children. It shows that children fed organic produce have significantly lower pesticide residues in their body than children fed conventional produce. The question now being taken up by the scientific community is, does this matter? Are kids actually being harmed by persistent and continuous exposure to low-level chemicals known to be inherently toxic? Are they more likely to develop, say, pediatric cancers, or experience early puberty, or suffer from learning disabilities or asthma? We haven't yet carried out the definitive scientific studies that would answer these questions. What we do know is that children are more innately sensitive to pesticide exposures than we adults are. We also have some new results from the Salinas Valley in California, and these show us that there's a connection between the levels of pesticides in children's urine on the one hand and their risk for neurodevelopmental problems on the other. We also have some provocative new data from England showing that kids who consume organic milk and yogurt are at lower risk for certain allergies and asthma. These studies need to be replicated by larger studies. The National Children's Study, which has recently been funded, is a long-term investigation that will be measuring exposures to toxic chemicals in children in their early life, and then will be following these children until they reach adulthood. It should be able to offer definitive answers to questions about the pediatric health effects of common environmental toxicants. But that's a 20-year study, and my own children will be adults by the time it's finished. As a biologist, I'm interested in how all that research is going to turn out. But as a mom, I have to act on the basis of the knowledge available now. And as a mother, I'm conservative. I take action to prevent harm in situations that seem inherently dangerous. That's why I childproofed my house. That's why I pay attention to car seat recalls. That's why I call my kids out of the lake at the first sound of distant rumbling of thunder. That's why in my household, if you choose to ride your bike without a bike helmet, your bike goes in the barn for a week. And in that same spirit, I choose to buy food for my children that's demonstrably lower in chemicals known to be inherently dangerous. On the basis of evidence available to me now, organic appears to me the safer choice. Reason for me is this. Organic food reflects my values. Eating organic provides all kinds of teachable moments. While looking for the organic options in the grocery store, my children and I talk about the land from which our dinner comes. We talk about the farmers who grow this food for us and how they treat the land and how they treat their animals. Jeff and I are also shareholders in a nearby farm that is organized on the principle of community-supported agriculture. In a CSA, the farm sells its produce directly to members who purchase a share of the season's harvest in early spring. And thanks to the Sweetland Farm, my children have gained all kinds of food and horticultural knowledge. They know that strawberries ripen before cherries, green beans come after peas. They know which varieties of radishes are spicy and which are mild. They know that peppers and tomatoes are both in the nightshade family. They know the difference between chard and kale, and they've learned to love them both. They wait eagerly for carrots. They worry about beets if it hasn't rained for a while. I believe organic food has helped make my kids excited about food. Both of them are willing to try almost anything, and the more colorful, the better. And as a working mother, I appreciate adventurous palates in children. I have neither the time nor the desire to cater to finicky eaters. Organic food does cost more than conventionally produced foods. Organic production is more strictly regulated, it requires more labor, and the farms tend to be smaller. But the lower price I pay at the checkout counter for conventional foods only represents a part of its true cost. There's also the price of cleaning up contaminated water, the loss of fish and wildlife, the cost of monitoring pesticide residues in everything from applesauce to lake sediments. There's the higher rate of childhood cancers in agricultural areas of the United States. There's the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, caused by farm chemicals used in Iowa and Illinois. There's the disappearance of crabs and oysters from the Chesapeake Bay, caused by dairy farming in Pennsylvania. There's the methamphetamine epidemic throughout rural America, fueled in part by access by criminals to synthetic fertilizers. And so my weekly food budget for organic groceries starts to look like a really good investment. And by supporting the Sweetland Farm, located less than a mile from our house, Jeff and I are contributing to the economic vigor of the countryside that rings our small village, thus preventing urban sprawl, which thus keeps the roads safe for children on bicycles, and also safeguards our groundwater supply that is the source of our drinking water. It also contributes to our food security. And teaching our children that the food we choose to eat says a lot about our family and what we value is also part of my parenting. Fifth and last, organic food promotes public health. And public health is just another way of saying human rights. Let's talk for a moment about antibiotics. This past winter in my household, we slogged through 1 case of pneumonia, mine, and 2 cases of strep throat. It was a really bad year for us. But antibiotics turned what could have been a truly terrifying experience into a lesson in the miracles of modern medicine. Within 48 hours in each case, we were all on the road to recovery. Shortly after the strep outbreak, my daughter and I read Little Women together. We cried when Beth dies of heart complications brought on by scarlet fever, which is a variation of strep. But I was able to reassure her that such an outcome would never happen to anyone in our family. And that reassurance is based on the knowledge that antibiotics are potent weapons when used judiciously in the fight against bacterial infection. Penicillin cures strep and prevents rheumatic fever. Mothers of sick children throughout history would have paid a king's ransom to get their hand on a drug like penicillin. Because of it, and its cousin azithromycin, I didn't have to look around my house last March and wonder which ones of us were going to die and which ones of us were going to make it through until April. I didn't have to write a will. I didn't have to plan a funeral. Routine use of antibiotics in conventional livestock operations is one of the factors driving the emergence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It's also increasing the transmission of these pathogens from animals to humans. Those were the conclusions of a 2.5-year study released last month from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And just saying those words out loud, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, gives me a chill. I choose to buy milk and yogurt that's organic so that I direct my food dollars to farmers who are not practicing intensive confinement of distressed animals prone to sickness and pumped up with antibiotics as a substitute for access to pasture and fresh air. To do otherwise would be like voting against my own interests. The problem with conventional agriculture goes beyond antibiotic resistance, though. According to a recent California study, living near agricultural fields where pesticides are sprayed raises the risks of stillbirths due to birth defects. Researchers found the largest risk among babies whose mothers lived within 1 mile of such areas during the first trimester of their pregnancies. A Minnesota study found that the children of farmers, as well as those born to families living in agricultural areas, have elevated rates of birth defects. In North Carolina, pesticide exposure has been linked to diabetes among pregnant women. Buying organic food, then, is something I can do to protect other mothers and their children. And as a mom, I care not only about the well-being of my own small children, but also about the well-being of their friends and their classmates, the whole generation to which my children belong. Children with learning disabilities, birth defects, and attention deficit problems affect all of us. I don't want the food I buy to come from chemically sprayed fields that may be triggering birth defects in the children of the mothers who live near them. I don't want my shopping habits contributing to preterm labor among mothers who drink pesticide-contaminated tap water downstream. I don't want to eat food whose production raises the risk of miscarriage and diabetes among women farmers and women farm workers who grow the food and harvest it for me. The current issue of Orion magazine features an article about farm worker communities in California's Central Valley who cannot even open the windows of their small homes because of pesticide drift. Said one mother quoted in the essay, "What good is the wind? It's all poison." Now, I hope by the time I'm a grandmother, the breezes of California are free from poison, and the curtains of Central Valley homes can flutter again in open windows. I hope that cows are no longer sources of terrifying diseases impervious to pharmaceutical interventions. I hope that farming is a friend and not an enemy of drinking water. I hope my son can fulfill his dream of being both a farmer and a president of the United States. I hope my daughter will have plenty of deep-sea creatures to study in the ocean's abyss. I hope that both my kids can tell their kids, "We ate a lot of organic food when we were little. That Grandma Sandra and Grandpa Jeff were sure ahead of their time." Well, thanks very much for listening. I'd like to close now with a short reading from my most recent book, Having Faith, named after my now 9-year-old daughter, Faith. And this is a scene set in Boston's Beth Israel Hospital. It's the scene of my amniocentesis, which is a medical procedure that some pregnant women undergo. About 30 cc's of amniotic fluid, about 1 shot glass full, is removed from her uterus through a really big needle. And there are chromosomes from the baby's skin that are floating around in that fluid, and those can be evaluated for chromosomal abnormalities. And happily, I got good news from my amnio, but it's a pretty stressful procedure. And I have a particular habit I need to tell you about. Whenever I undergo particularly stressful medical procedures, I meditate on some biological phenomenon that I'm especially fond of. I've gotten through entire colonoscopies thinking about photosynthesis or cardiac output. So what I chose to think about during my amniocentesis was hummingbirds. I just kind of pulled that out of the air. So what you're going to hear is the action going on in the hospital room, and then this internal monologue of me and the hummingbirds. So here it is. This is the moment that the needle goes in. Everyone else is watching this moment on the screen of the ultrasound monitor. I am not. I am thinking very hard and very deliberately about hummingbirds. The nests of hummingbirds are constructed of spider webs and dandelion down. They are lined with lichens and moss. They usually contain 2 eggs. I glance down briefly. The syringe is half full of fluid already. The eggs are the size of peas. When baby hummingbirds hatch, they are said to resemble wet bumblebees. The first syringe is replaced by a second. Hummingbirds fly over the Gulf of Mexico from the Yucatan in a single night. It's a distance of, 500 miles. Some of them probably came across last night, assuming the high-pressure system over New England extends all the way down there. The second syringe is taking longer to fill up. I don't like hummingbirds. They're too impossibly small, too nervous, insect-like whirring. Still, the entire Gulf in a single flight is impressive, you have to admit that. The needle is out. We're done. The mood is still upbeat. The obstetrician hands the pair of vials to the technician, who holds them up to the light like glasses of fine wine. Nice color, she says. Do you want to hold them? As she presses the vials into my hands, hot as blood, the fluid inside is pale gold. It seems to glow. Well, it's like liquid amber, I sputter. Amniotic fluid is like an amber jewel. It occurs to me that amniotic fluid is the loveliest substance I have ever seen. The obstetrician touches my arm. That's baby pee, she says, smiling. We like it yellow. It's a sign of good kidney functioning. I look at the vials again. Oh, right, I say. Drink plenty of water, the obstetrician says as she finishes up. Drink plenty of water. Before it is baby pee, amniotic fluid is water. I drink water, and it becomes blood plasma, which suffuses through the amniotic sac and surrounds the baby who also drinks it. And what is it before that? Before it is drinking water, amniotic fluid is the creeks and rivers that fill reservoirs. It is the underground water that fills wells. And before it is creeks and rivers and groundwater, amniotic fluid is rain. When I hold in my hands a tube of my own amniotic fluid, I am holding a tube full of raindrops. Amniotic fluid is the juice of oranges I had for breakfast, and the milk I poured over my cereal, the honey I stirred into my tea. It is inside the green cells of spinach leaves and the damp flesh of apples. It is the yolk of an egg. When I look at amniotic fluid, I am looking at rain falling on orange groves. I am looking at melon fields, potatoes in wet earth, frost on pasture grasses. The blood of cows and chickens is in this tube. The nectar gathered by bees and hummingbirds is in this tube. Whatever is inside hummingbird eggs is also inside me. Whatever is in the world's water is here in my hand. Thank you.